بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. محاضرة اليوم في مادة الشعر الإنجليزي الحديث عن الشاعر توماس ستيرنز إليوت، وإحدى أبرز أعماله الشعرية وهي قصيدة Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock، يلقيها المدرس خالد قيس لطلبة المرحلة الرابعة قسم اللغة الإنجليزية كلية التربية للعلوم الإنسانية. Good morning dear students. I'm here today to deliver a lecture about one of the pillars of modern poetry, who is T.S. Eliot, known as T.S. Eliot, and his masterpiece entitled Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. In fact, this lecture is going to cover the following points. First, Thomas Stearns Eliot, the life and works. This point will focus on the literary career of the poet, his major works in poetry, and his major essays in particular. The second point is going to deal with one of his distinctive essays that is related to poetry, and it is very important to read it when we study Thomas Stearns Eliot as a poet. It is entitled Tradition and the Individual Talent. Third, we shall give a critical introduction to Eliot's poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and then we are going to deal with the poem. We shall give a critical analysis to the poem. We shall focus on structure of the poem, characters in the poem, the significance of the poem's epigraph, the journey in the poem, and the poem as a modern one, and then we shall give certain critical appraisals about the poem said by the notable critics of the 20th century modern poetry. Life and works of Thomas Stearns Eliot. Thomas Stearns Eliot was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1888. He published his first poetic masterpiece, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, in 1915. In 1921, he wrote the poem entitled The Waste Land while recovering from exhaustion. The dense allusion-heavy poem went on to redefine the genre and become one of the most talked about poems in the literary history. Eliot was born in St. Louis, Missouri in this year, and he started his literary career as a poet. He writes such great and notable works like The Waste Land, Ash Wednesday, The Love Song, and many other plays and non-fiction. Eliot began courses at Harvard University in 1906, graduating 3 years later in a Bachelor of Arts degree at Harvard. He was greatly influenced by professors renowned in poetry at that time. Philosophy and literary criticism, and the rest of his literary career would be shaped by all three. After graduating, Eliot served as a philosophy assistant at Harvard for a year, and then left for France and the Sorbonne to study philosophy at that time. It was around this time that Eliot began lifelong friendship with the American poet Ezra Pound, who immediately recognized Eliot's poetic genius and worked to publish his work. The first poem of this period, and the first of Eliot's important works, was The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which is our concern in this lecture. It appeared in Poetry in 1915. His first book of poems, Prufrock and Other Observations, followed in 1917, and the collection of established Eliot as a leading poet of his times. While writing poetry and tending to his day job, Eliot was busy writing literary criticism and reviews, and his work in the criticism field would become as respected as his poetry. So Thomas Stearns Eliot is not only a poet, he is a poet, a critic, a literary historian, and a playwright as well. Whatever else aloof, Eliot continued to write about his major later poems include Ash Wednesday, published in 1930, and Four Quarters, published in 1943, and during this period he also wrote The Use of Poetry and the Use of Criticism in 1933, and Notes Towards the Definition of Culture in 1940. It was around this time that Eliot began a lifelong friendship with his, friend named Ezra Pound, and he started for that purpose, I mean this relationship, his works will never be outdated, and his inner grasp of the kaleidoscopic patterns of lives in this verse can be considered as a great source of enlightenment for the modern man's crises and sufferings at that time. The prominent literary works of Eliot are Prufrock and Other Observations in 1917, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, Portrait of a Lady, it is a poem, a long poem, Aunt Helen, Whispers of Immortality, Mr. Eliot's Sunday Morning, A Cooking Egg, and The Wasteland, which is published in 1922. Thomas Terence Eliot is of incomparable significance and a vast source of inspiration and enlightenment for the readers who are interested in the variety of mysteries and the profundity of human existence. Now, if we study Eliot as a poet, we need to have an idea about, or we need to read this essay which relates to the craft of poetry as coined by Eliot in the early 20th century. It is entitled Tradition and the Individual Talent. This essay was first published in 1919 in Times Literary Supplement. In this essay, Eliot defends the role of tradition in helping new writers to be modern. It is one of the central paradoxes that Eliot's writings that in order to move forward, it often looks to the past, even more directly and more pointedly than previous poets had. This essay also represents the basis of all Eliot's subsequent critical efforts. It consists of three main parts. The first part tackles the concept of criticism. The second part is concerned with the theory of impersonality in poetry. And the third part sums up the whole discussion of the essay. The contents of this essay can be summed up as follows. First of all, the function of criticism and the role of tradition in that concept. According to Eliot, the work of a poet in the present is to be compared and contrasted with the works of the past and judged by the standards of the past as well. But this judgment does not mean determining good or bad. It does not mean deciding whether the present work is better or worse than the works of the past. An author in the present is certainly not to be judged by the principles and the standards of the past. The comparison is to be made by knowing the facts, all the facts about the new work of art. It is made for the purposes of analysis and for forming a better understanding of the new. Moreover, this comparison is reciprocal. The past helps us to understand the present, and the present throws light on the past. It is in this way alone that we can form an idea of what is really individual and new in poetry. It is by the comparison alone that we can shift the traditional form and the individual elements in a given work of art. Eliot tackles the idea that the knowledge of writers of the past makes contemporary writers both part of that tradition and part of the contemporary scene as well. The dynamic conception of a tradition, its role and significance, the theory of impersonality. As far as poetry is concerned, the artist must continually surrender himself to something which is more valuable than himself. So Eliot wants to say that anything that is impersonal is essential, is intrinsic in writing a poem that fulfills the needs of a modern reader. The literary tradition, he must allow the poetic sensibility to be shaped and modified by the past. The poet must continue to acquire the sense of tradition throughout his career. In the beginning, his self, his individuality may assert itself, but as his powers mature, there must be a greater and greater extinction of personality. He must acquire greater and greater objectivity in writing poetry. His emotions and passions must be depersonalized. He must be as impersonal, as objective as a scientist or a scholar. The personality of the artist, according to Eliot, is not as important as the thing is his sense of tradition. A good poem is a living whole of all that poetry that has even been written. He must forget his personal joys and sorrows, and he absorbed in acquiring a sense of a tradition and expressing it in his poetry. Thus, the poet's personality is merely a medium having the same significance as a catalytic agent or a receptacle in which chemical reactions take place. That is why Eliot holds that honest criticism and sensitive appreciation is directed not upon the poet, but upon the poetry itself. Another point that relates to poetry in this essay is the poetic process and the analogy of a catalyst. In the second part of the essay, Eliot develops further his theory of impersonality of poetry, which is very important. As I told you, dear students, you need to read this essay before you study the major works of Eliot, because they will provide you with the keys of analyzing the poems, or with the clues of enabling you to understand Eliot as a poet from a philosophical point of view. Especially, he lived and wrote in a very modern age, that is the early modern age, exactly between the two world wars, the First and the Second World Wars, which is considered the purely modern movement in English literature in general and in the art of poetry in particular. Eliot compares the mind of the poet to a catalyst in a process of poetic creation, to the process of chemical reaction. Just as chemical reactions take in the presence of a catalyst alone, so also the poet's mind is a catalytic agent for combining different emotions into something new. Suppose there is a jar containing oxygen and sulfur dioxide. These two gases combine to form sulfurous acid when a fine filament of platinum is introduced into the jar. The combination takes place only in the presence of the piece of platinum, but the metal itself does not undergo any change. It remains inert, neutral, and unaffected. This is something exactly just like the mind of the poet. It is like the catalytic agent. For a poet, it is very necessary for new combinations of emotions and experiences to take place, but it itself does not undergo any change during the process of poetic combination. The mind of the poet is constantly forming emotions and experiences into new wholes, but the new combination does not contain even a trace of the poet's mind, just as the newly formed sulfurous acid does not contain any trace of platinum. In the case of a young and immature poet, his or her mind, his or her personal emotions and experiences may find some expression in his composition, but, says Eliot, I shall quote from the essay, the more perfect the artist, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers and the mind which creates. The test of the maturity of the poem, as Eliot indicates, is that it is related to the point of, you see, how does he focus on the task of a poet who is supposed to be more and more impersonal in writing a poem, and at the same time he says that a poet, as he cites, the more perfect the artist and the more completely separate in him will be the man, referring to the poet, the man who suffers and the mind which creates. The test of the maturity of the artist is the completeness with which his man digests the transmutes the passions which form the substance in his poetry. Now we get to the poem. The love song of J. Alfred Prufrock is considered as one of the masterpieces written in the modern age by Eliot, and it is written in a stream of consciousness style which appears chaotic, and there are 4 movements in the poem. The dots used in the poem on the pages indicate these passages, outline 69, 74, and 110. 3 divisions and 4 sections. So the poem is relatively long. Eliot employs the stream of consciousness style in which the writer's thoughts seem to flow at random, as if the writer was sharing his unstructured thoughts with the reader. Note that, as a rule, we only impose a structure on our thoughts by either debating the matter at hand or by writing about it. The poem consists of 4 parts. In the first part, the Prufrock set out on his journey. In the second part, the Prufrock tries to unburden himself to his beloved, but he fails. In the third part, the Prufrock rationalizes his failure, and at last, Prufrock realizes he has betrayed all that is imaginative and beautiful. He is condemned to superficial existence. Note, dear students, that in using the idea of the journey, Eliot is being ironic. In the literature of the past, the journey is traditionally associated with the heroic figure, like for example Ulysses and Dante, who develop spiritually on their journey. Also in traditional literature, the physical journey becomes a metaphor for the hero's spiritual journey. In Prufrock's case, this situation is reversed. At the end of his journey, Prufrock is weaker spiritually than at the beginning. We have only 2 characters in this poem, Prufrock and a woman, a nameless woman. Prufrock has 2 characters, the you and I. The you is Prufrock's public image, which is present in the poem, and the face he presents in the world. The I is Prufrock's innermost self, which he keeps hidden from everyone, even the woman herself. Now before we start reading the poem, the text of the poem, we need to have an idea about the thematic significance of the epigraph. Eliot initiates the poem with a quotation that is called Epigraph, which includes an incident that is highly coincident with the situation of the main character in the poem. There is a contrast between the serious epigraph from Dante's Inferno and the lighter Prufrock's love song announced in the title. In fact, the mixture of levity and seriousness is to be found throughout the whole poem, whereas we had just been told that the poem is a love song of a character called the Prufrock. In the epigraph, we are given the words of another character named Guido, da Montefeltro, a man condemned to tell in a person of flame for his treacherous advice on earth to Pope Boniface. Guido tells the shame of his wicked life to Dante, and only because he delivers that Dante will never return to earth to report what he says. As far as this epigraph is concerned, there is a high coincidence between the 2 situations of Guido and the Prufrock. So Eliot intends to deliver the whole message of the poem in the opening epigraph. A critic named A.D. Moody, in his book entitled Thomas Stearns Eliot, a Poet, suggests that the similarity of the situation between the Prufrock and the Guido, both are in hell. Prufrock finds himself in a situation in a society which is like hell from him, and believes like Guido that there is no way out. We should never ignore the epigraph in Eliot's because it gives hints of the meaning of the message of the poem as a whole. The epigraph also is an Italian quotation, introduces the poem as a whole. It is taken from Dante's Inferno. On his journey throughout hell, Dante met the spirit of Count Guido da Montefeltro. The other part of the poem is the journey. Note that the Prufrock's journey is not the one we would expect from such a conservative figure, J. Alfred. Almost immediately it is suggestive of the seamy side of life, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels. The journey portrays a disturbing image of humanity. I shall quote from the poem. Streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent. Here, Prufrock is clearly a troubled character. The you and I indicate the division within him. So he is a spiritually defeated man. The image of a patient etherized upon a table relates not to the evening but rather to Prufrock himself. He is transferring to the evening his own inner need to undergo the examination and a form of surgery, metaphorically speaking. The overwhelming question is something that is continually shies away. That he continually shies away from. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Referring to the question, to the overwhelming question. The initial part of the journey then sees Prufrock struggling both with his own character and his concept of humanity. Both will lead him to an overwhelming question, and this later is never defined. The failure to reveal and to achieve intimacy in the poem. Lines 70 to 74 deal with Prufrock's failure to reveal his inner self to the woman. His self-loathing is now at its mock intense. I should have been a pair of ragged clothes, scuttling across the floors of silent seas. Put it in other words, Prufrock feels is an inferior form of life. The phrase ragged clothes scuttling suggests his own content of his timidity. He belongs to silent seas because of his failure to talk out or to speak out. Prufrock's self-disgust stems from more than a contempt for snobbery and selfishness. The yellow fog indicates not so much the physical pollution of our environment as the spiritual pollution of ourselves. The cat-like fog is linked to filth. Another quotation. Licked its tongue into the corners of the evening, lingered upon the pools that stand in drains, let fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys. Note also, dear students, that Prufrock is aware of man's capacity to murder and create. Prufrock can murder his I, or inner self, and create, invent his you, or the outer self. The I is of course presenting his capacity for goodness. Man then has the dual capacity to murder and to create. But in Prufrock's world, his distinction is lost and prevented into nauseating hypocrisy. As a whole, the poem is considered as a typical modern poem because in this sense that it reflects the troubled consciousness of a 20th century man. So the modern man is presented as a figure, a typical figure that is Prufrock himself. And the defining feature of the 20th century man is uncertainty about himself and his place, purpose in the world. The reasons behind that is primarily to be found in a materialistic society, a society which suffers from wars and from the many crises, the social, the moral, and even the political. And in this society, all the spiritual values declined, and man becomes in a situation that is so-called the death in life, referring to the spiritual deadness, and as it is imaged through the character of the defeated, the timid Prufrock. This is the word of Prufrock: superficial, unhappy, lacking an idealism and commitment, lacking in spiritual values, and ending in despair. Now we shall have an idea about what the prominent critics in the 20th century say about this poem. A critic named F.R. Lewis tells us that the love song represents a complete break with the 19th century tradition and a new start. It must indeed have been difficult to take seriously in 1917, for it defies the traditional canon of seriousness. He adds, Prufrock is concerned with the directly personal embarrassments, disillusions, and distresses of a sophisticated young man. He refers to the modern man, a man living in such a complex age, that is the modern age, in which life becomes totally materialistic and the spiritual values decline totally. Man lives in a sense of bewilderment, and he feels that he is spiritually empty and there is no any value for his purpose or existence in his life. Another critic named Stephen Spender writes, "The love song of J. Alfred Prufrock is the dramatic monologue of a man of uncertain age," referring to the modern age, "who speaks out of a life whose center is a society drawing room, approached through the streets, the description of which provides metaphors for the squalor and also the mystery and the beauty of a city unnamed, which nevertheless seems representative of other great cities." He refers to the community or to the milieu in which modern man lives and also suffers. To conclude, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock is certainly modern in tone and diction. Eliot wrote a new kind of poetry with irregular rhyming, verse paragraphs, free verse, new themes and attitudes. It is related to the French symbolist movement or Henry James, the great figure. The poem still remains an original piece of poetry. This is the opinion of the great American figure in the modern age. He says that it had a great effect on modern literature in English, as the critic John Berryman states or adds, after quoting the third line of the poem, "With this line, modern poetry begins." So there is a hint said by John Berryman referring to the poem. It refers to the groundbreaking of modern poetry, referring to the start of the modern age in the early 20th century.